morning of the 11th of March, 1856, came grey and low over Blacksod Bay, on the westernmost edge of County Mayo, where the land gives out into nothing but 4,000 miles of open Atlantic. There was a heavy swell running that day, the kind the old men on the Mullet Peninsula called a dead sea, a swell with no wind behind it, moving as if pushed by something far out and unseen. 4 fishermen had taken a curragh out before dawn to lift a string of lobster pots below the cliffs near Fallmore, and it was on the way back, with the light just beginning to grey the water, that one of them saw a shape lifting and falling in the trough of the waves, perhaps 40 yards off their bow. At first, they took it for a seal. Then, as the swell carried it up onto a crest and held it there for a moment against the pale sky, they took it for a drowned man, and they turned the boat toward it, because that is what men of that coast did. The sea gave up its dead often enough on the Mullet, and there was an obligation older than any church to bring a body home to be buried in ground. But as they drew alongside, the oars slowed, and then they stopped rowing altogether. The thing in the water was too long. That was the first wrong note, the one none of them could explain afterward, and none of them ever forgot. A tall man drowned and bloated will look large, swollen by the sea, but this was not swelling. This was length. The body lay stretched along the surface, face upward, arms at its sides, and it ran a full head and shoulders longer than the tallest of the 4 men in the boat, who was a Barrett from Agliam, and stood well over 6 feet on land. It floated high, unnaturally high, riding the swell like a spar of pale wood, and it did not roll or turn as a drowned body turns. It held its posture. It lay as if it had been laid down on the water by careful hands. And it was clothed. Not clothed the way a lost sailor is clothed, in a sodden wool jersey and canvas trousers gone black with brine. This was a single garment, grey, the grey of wet ash, that covered the whole of the body from the throat down to where the feet should be, and it clung to the form beneath it, not the way cloth clings, but the way a second skin clings, without folds, without a collar, without any seam that the men could see. It moved with the body as one thing. When the swell lifted the corpse, the garment lifted with it, smooth and unbroken, and the water ran off it in sheets rather than soaking into it, as though whatever it was made of did not care for the sea at all. They got a boat hook into it. Barrett was the one who did it, reaching out over the gunwale and taking hold below the shoulder, and he said later, in the one account that survives of that morning, that the body was heavier than it looked and colder than the water, and that when the hook took hold, the flesh did not give the way drowned flesh gives. It was firm. It was set. As if the thing had been dead a long while and yet had not begun to come apart, though the crabs and the gulls and the salt should have been at it for days out on that swell. They did not pull it into the boat. No man among them would have it lying against his legs in the bottom of a curragh 4 miles from shore, and I do not think you would have either. Instead, they made a line fast under its arms, and they towed it, slowly, keeping it well astern, the 4 of them rowing in silence, and not one of them looking back at the long grey shape that followed them through the water with its face to the sky. It took them the better part of 2 hours to bring it into the shingle strand below Fallmore, and by the time they grounded the curragh, a small crowd had come down from the cabins along the shore, because word travels fast in a place like that, and a body from the sea is a thing the whole townland turns out for. Men waded in to help drag it up above the rack line onto the stones, and that was the moment, with a dozen people now standing over it in the strengthening light, that the wrongness of the thing stopped being something felt and became something seen, because up close, out of the water, on the wet grey stones of the strand, it was worse. I want to be careful here, at the beginning, to give you only what the witnesses gave, and to give it slowly, the way it came to them. They saw a body, and it was shaped like a man. It had a head, 2 arms, a torso that narrowed at the waist, the whole architecture of a human being. If you had shown a single part of it to a stranger, an arm, a shoulder, they would have said a man lies here. It was the whole of it together that no one could account for. The length of the limbs against the length of the trunk, the stillness of it. And the garment, which even the women who had washed 100 drowned bodies for burial could not name, could not identify, could not find an edge to. Nobody would touch the face. They had crowded round the body readily enough, but they left a space at the head of it, a clear arc of stones where no one stood, and when the priest came down the strand later that day and asked them what the face looked like, the answers he wrote down were not descriptions, they were refusals. One woman blessed herself and would not speak. One man said only that its eyes were not shut the way a dead man's eyes are shut. Another said he had looked once and would not look again, and that he did not want it in the ground near his own people. That is where this begins. A tall, robed figure hauled dripping from the Atlantic swell off the far edge of Ireland on a grey morning in March, laid out on the shingle by frightened hands, wearing something no drowned sailor ever wore, in a body too long and too still to belong to any man of that coast or any coast the men of Mayo had ever sailed to. It lay there on the stones through the middle of that day, and the tide came up the strand toward it, and someone was sent on foot over the boreen to the chapel to fetch the one man in the parish whose duty it was to kneel beside the dead. His name was Father Coleman, and what he did when he reached that strand, and what he took from the body, and what was done to him afterward for having seen it, is the reason you have never heard this story until now. But before I bring the priest onto the shingle, I want you to stand where the fishermen stood and see what the daylight showed them once the morning haze had burned off the water. Because in the first grey light, when the thing came up on the ropes, it had been a shape only, a long weight fighting the swell. It was noon, with the sun fully on the strand and the tide muttering closer over the stones, that the body resolved into detail, and it was the detail that broke them. 7 feet. That is the figure that comes down to us, and I want to be careful with it, because 7 feet is exactly the length a frightened man reaches for when he wants to say too long. But there is a reason to believe it here, and the reason is a boat. The men who hauled it laid it out alongside one of their own currachs, drawn up on the shingle, a working boat of a known build, and the account that survives measures the body against the length of that hull, from the stem to the third rib. That is not the language of a terrified exaggeration. That is a man reaching for the nearest honest ruler he owned and holding the corpse against it. And by that ruler, the body ran the better part of 7 feet, laid straight, with the feet unpointed and the head thrown slightly back on the stones. The flesh was pale in a way that unsettled the women more than the length did. Drowned bodies come back to the coast of Mayo in every condition the sea can make of them, and the women who prepared the dead for burial in that parish had seen all of it, the swollen and the fish-taken, and the white bloodless kind that has been long in cold water. This was none of those. The word that comes down, in more than one telling, is waxen, not the grey of a week's drowning, not the blue-white of the newly dead. A smooth, even candle-pale surface, firm to the eye, as if the body had never been in the water long enough to soften, and yet had come up out of deep water all the same. There was no bloating, there was no swelling of the features. It had the composed, unspoiled look of a body laid out an hour after death by careful hands, and it had come off the Atlantic in March. And then the hands. The hands are the part of this that I have turned over longest, because the hands are the part the finders agreed on. Where they whispered about the face and refused about the eyes, they were plain about the hands, and they were plain because the hands were folded, one over the other, low on the trunk, in the exact attitude in which the dead of that faith were laid in their coffins. Nobody had folded them. The men who brought it up had not touched it more than the ropes required. The women had not dressed it. It had come out of the sea with its hands already composed for burial, as though something had prepared it before it was given to the water, or as though it had arranged itself, deliberately, at the end. Between the fingers of those folded hands there was skin. A web, low and thick, running from the base of one finger to the next, of the kind you will find drawn in the plates of any old natural history of the diving birds and the seals. Not the thin, translucent web of a frog. A heavy fold, the finders said, like the foot of a great water bird, and the fingers themselves too long for the palm, and ending not in a swimmer's soft pads, but in something harder that the men would not describe as nails, and would not describe as claws either. They said the hands were the worst of it precisely because they were folded so gently. A monstrous thing thrashing in a net is a thing you can fear cleanly. A monstrous thing lying with its webbed hands laid quietly over its breast, arranged, patient, waiting to be found, is a thing that fear cannot get a grip on, and that is the thing that lay on the shingle at noon. Now the robe. I have kept the robe for last, because the robe is the hinge on which this entire account turns, the single detail that lifts it out of the long catalogue of strange carcasses washed up on Atlantic beaches, and makes it something that men felt they had to bury twice. A dead animal, however wrong, is a dead animal. This one was clothed. It wore a single garment, grey, close to the colour of wet slate, that covered it from the throat to below the knee, and the garment was fused to the flesh so completely that the women who tried to lift an edge of it could not find where cloth ended and body began. They looked for a seam. That is what a woman who has shrouded the dead does. Her hands go to the seams, to the hem, to the fastening, because that is how you undress and wash a corpse. There were no seams. There was no hem that behaved as a hem. There was no fastening at the throat, no lacing, no button, no pin, no join at the shoulder where every garment ever sewn by human hands must have a join. It was, in the word one of them used, whole, as if it had been grown and not made, as if the thing had come into the world already wearing it, and they could not name the cloth. These were people who knew wool in every weave their own hands could make of it, who knew canvas and sailcloth and the oiled stuff the fishermen wore against the spray, who knew linen and the coarse frieze of their own coats. This was none of them. It did not soak the way wool soaks and hang heavy. The water seemed to stand off it, to bead and run, so that even wet from the sea, the surface of it had a dull sheen the finders kept returning to in their descriptions. It was warm, one account says, warmer than the flesh under it, though I do not know what to do with that, and I will not pretend to. It was seamless, and it was strange to the touch, and it would not be named, and it clothed a body that no man of that coast could name either, and the pairing of those two facts is what emptied that ark of stones at the head of the corpse and kept it empty. Think of what that means, standing on the strand. A drowned sailor is a story the sea tells every winter. A great fish, a basking shark rotted down to its cartilage, a seal bloated past knowing, a whale calf half consumed, these too are stories the coast knew and had names for and buried without a priest. But a body that is neither man nor any fish, that is longer than a man and webbed like a diving thing and waxen where it should be foul, and that arrived clothed in a garment with no maker's mark of seam or stitch upon it, its hands folded as if some hand had readied it for the grave before the water ever took it. That is not a thing the sea threw up by accident. That is a thing that looks, to every eye that stood over it, deliberate. Dressed, sent or come, in a shape meant to be found, and meant to be laid in the ground, with its hands already crossed. That was the impossibility the fishermen were standing around when the boy sent for the priest came back over the boreen with him. They had a body they could not touch, a face they could not describe, and a garment they could not name, and the tide was coming up the strand to take all three of those things back before anyone with authority could set eyes on them. And into that, down the last slope of shingle in the middle of the afternoon, came the one man whose whole office was to kneel where others would not, and to speak for the dead who could no longer speak. He knelt, and what he saw at that range, close enough to touch the face the others would not look at, is what the rest of this story was built to bury. His name, as far as the thinned record allows me to reconstruct it, was Father Coleman, a curate, not a parish priest of long standing, attached to the mission that served the scattered townlands along that stretch of the Mayo coast in the middle years of the century. I have not been able to fix his full name with certainty, and I will tell you honestly why later, because the reason he is hard to name is itself part of what happened here. But the outline survives. He was a man in perhaps his early 40s in 1856, ordained a decade or more of the generation of priests who had walked that coast through the worst of the famine years and had buried more of their own people than any man should have to, often without coffins, often without the time to say the whole of the office over them. He was, in other words, a man who had knelt beside the dead more times than he could have counted, and who had long since lost the capacity to be frightened by a corpse. That is the detail I keep returning to. Whatever knelt on that shingle beside the robed body was not a squeamish man, not a young man untested by death, not a stranger to the swollen and the drowned and the half-eaten things the Atlantic gives back. He had seen all of it, and he stayed on his knees beside this one for the better part of an hour. An hour. Fix that in your mind against what the fisherman did, which was to stand back at the length of a boat and refuse to close the distance. The priest closed it. He went down onto the wet stones directly beside the head, at the very range the others could not bear, close enough that the face they described only in whispers was a hand's breadth from his own. And he did not recoil, and he did not hurry through a blessing and rise, which is what the office would have permitted and what any tired man would have done. He knelt there in the coming tide long enough that the water was reportedly around his boots before he stood. What holds a man of that experience in that posture for that length of time is not grief, because he did not know the dead. It is not duty, because duty is discharged in 3 minutes. It is the thing you do when you are looking at something your whole training has no category for, and you are trying, with the only instrument you have, which is prayer, to decide what it is you are consecrating. And then he did the thing that turned a strange death into a buried one. He took the robe. He did not leave it on the body to go into the ground with it, which is what you do with a drowned man's clothes when you cannot identify him. He removed the seamless grey garment from the corpse, or a portion of it, and he carried it away with him up off the strand. I want you to understand how far outside ordinary practice that single act sits. A priest does not strip the dead. A priest of the Roman Church in 1856 does not remove the covering from a body he has just blessed and take it home under his arm. He did it because he understood, kneeling there, that the garment was the evidence, that the body would rot or be reburied or wash out again. But the robe, the impossible unstitched robe with no maker's mark and no seam, was the one thing that could be carried into a room with light in it and examined and shown. He was not a fool. He was preserving the proof. And within a day, perhaps 2, he wrote. 3 pages, in his own hand, is what the surviving trace insists upon. 3 pages set down while the thing was fresh in front of his eyes, before anyone had told him what he was and was not permitted to have seen. We do not have those 3 pages. I want to be precise about that, because I will not build this on a document I cannot show you. What we have is the wound where they were. What we have is a single line in Coleman's hand that survived elsewhere, in a place his bishop's men did not think to reach, and the fact, attested in the shape of the record rather than its content, that 3 pages once existed and then did not. But consider the sequence, because the sequence is everything. The man knelt. The man took the robe. The man wrote 3 pages. And then the bishop's men arrived. They arrived quickly. That is the detail that curdles the whole account. A strange body on a remote strand in Mayo should have been, at most, a matter for the local coroner and a paragraph in a provincial paper. It should not have summoned anyone from the diocesan authority at speed. But someone in that chain of frightened fishermen and talking neighbours carried word inland fast enough, and word was received with enough alarm that men acting for the bishop came down to that parish not to comfort and not to investigate, but to close. And what they closed thoroughly in 3 separate places, and each of those 3 erasures is documentable in a way the body itself never was. The first is the parish register. Every death, every burial, every act of the office over the dead was entered in the register of that mission in a continuous hand, month upon month, year upon year. That is the whole purpose of the book, and its continuity is its authority. Go and look at what survives of that register for 1856, and you will find that the leaf-covering march is gone. Not blank, not skipped, torn. A page physically removed from a bound book whose every other page is intact, at precisely the month the robed body came ashore. A blank entry is carelessness. A torn leaf is a decision. Someone put their fingers into that book and pulled, and the tear is still there for anyone to run a thumb along. The second is the priest himself. Within a short time of the find, the interval is a matter of weeks, not seasons. Father Coleman was reassigned, moved off the coast entirely and set inland to a parish among fields and away from the water, away from the fishermen who had stood on that strand and away from the strand itself. A curate can be moved for 100 innocent reasons, and I have weighed every one of them. But the timing does not permit innocence its usual benefit. A man kneels beside an impossible thing, takes its robe, writes 3 pages, and is then lifted bodily from the place where all of that happened and set down somewhere he can no longer be asked about it. That is not a posting, that is a removal, and the third is the coroner's return. When a body comes ashore, there is a legal machinery that turns, however slowly, in a document. The finders are named, the circumstance recorded, the disposal noted. That is a civil record, outside the church entirely, kept for reasons of law. And in the return that ought to hold the names of the men who found the robed body on that Mayo strand, those names are struck, not absent, as they would be if the men had never come forward. Struck, the record thinned at exactly the point where it should have been fullest, the witnesses unwritten from the one document whose entire function was to remember them. 3 institutions, 3 separate hands, the church book and the priest and the civil return, all pruned at the same joint in the same season. And here is the thing I cannot argue my way past, the thing that has kept me inside this material longer than I meant to stay. You do not tear a page and reassign a man and strike a coroner's list for a rotted shark or a bloated seal or a drowned sailor. The coast had names for all of those and buried them without ceremony and without concealment for 1,000 years. You go to that trouble, that coordinated and rapid trouble across 3 kinds of record, only for something you have decided must not be remembered. The erasure is not evidence that nothing happened. The erasure is the measurement of how much happened. They did not bury it once in the ground above the tide. They buried it twice, once in the earth and once in the paper. And it is the second burial, the deliberate emptying of the books, that tells you exactly how frightened the men who ordered it were of the thing Father Coleman had knelt beside for an hour and refused, for the rest of his silenced life, to unsee. So follow it now to the end, because there is one more movement, and it is the burial itself, the physical fate of the body, the part the title promised you. They did not throw it back. That is the first thing to hold. A coast that had cast 1,000 nightmares back into the swell without a second thought chose, this time, to keep it. The robed body was carried up off the shingle above the reach of the highest spring tide to a strip of rough ground where the macaire meets the older grass, and it was put into the earth there without a coffin, because there was no coffin that length in the parish, and no carpenter willing to make one to the measure they would have had to give him. 7 feet, and the robe left on it. That detail comes to us from the one line of Father Coleman's that survives, and I will come to how it survived, but hold it. They buried it clothed. Whatever the grey, seamless garment was, they did not strip it for study or for burning. They left it fused to the body it had arrived wearing, and they closed the ground over both, and they marked the place. Not with a name, not with a cross, not with a date, none of the things a Christian burial requires, and all of which Coleman, a priest standing over a grave, would ordinarily have insisted upon. They marked it with a single flat stone, unlettered, the kind you would set to remember where a boundary ran or where a beast had been put down. A stone that says here without saying what. I have stood at the stretch of coast where local memory, thin as it is, places that ground, and I will tell you honestly I could not find it, and I do not think it is findable now, because the second half of this story is that the grave did not stay closed. In 1901, 45 years on, both the priest and the bishop long dead, the fisherman dead, the whole generation that had touched this thing gone under their own lettered stones, the grave above the tide line was opened. I have not been able to establish to the standard I would want on whose authority. There is a note, third hand, in the papers of a Westport antiquarian who was assembling a folklore collection in the first years of the century, that a burial of unusual length, said to be of a stranger cast up in the 50s, was dug into on that stretch of coast, and that the diggers found it empty, not decayed, not reduced to the long bones and the skull that 45 years in wet ground would leave. Empty. The stone lifted, the ground opened to the depth the body had been laid, and nothing in it, no bone, no cloth, no stain of a body having lain there at all. Now I want to be careful, because this is exactly the point in a story like this, where the material wants to run away with you. An empty grave has ordinary explanations. The location in local memory may simply have been wrong, and they dug where nothing had ever been. The body may have been quietly moved in the intervening decades by someone acting on the same instinct that struck the coroner's names, moved to somewhere less findable, less diggable, less likely to be turned up by an antiquarian with a spade and a notebook. A grave in soft coastal ground, above the tide but not beyond the reach of storm and slippage, can be scoured out and its contents carried off by the sea over 45 winters, and the Mayo coast has done exactly that to marked churchyards within living memory. I hold all of those. Any one of them empties the grave without a single strange thing occurring. But here is what none of them touch. Whatever the truth of 1901, the record of it is as thin and as pruned as everything else in this case. The antiquarian's note names no diggers. It gives no date within the year. It was never followed up, never published in the folklore volume it was gathered for, never turned into the small local sensation that an empty grave of a 7-foot stranger ought to have become. It sits in a private collection as a single crossed-through paragraph, and crossed through is the phrase I keep returning to across half a century of this story. The church book torn at March, the coroner's name struck, and now this last line drawn through the last account of the last time anyone looked. The same hand, institutionally speaking, the same reflex. Something is found, something is written, and then someone reaches back and thins the writing at exactly the joint that mattered. So what do we actually have left? We have almost nothing, and that almost nothing is the whole point. We have 3 pages that Father Coleman wrote before the bishop's men reached him, and we do not have the 3 pages. They were taken with the robe, and neither has surfaced in any diocesan archive I or anyone I have corresponded with has been able to open. What we have is a single sentence, copied out by Coleman himself into the flyleaf of a breviary he kept until his death inland at the parish they had moved him to, a book that passed to a niece and from her into a county collection where I read it. 1 sentence in a priest's careful hand, and it is not a description of a monster. That is what undoes me about it. A frightened man inventing a sea devil writes about teeth and eyes and horror. Coleman wrote this: "It was dressed, and it was facing the shore, and I do not believe it drowned by accident." That is all. That is the whole of what the man who knelt beside it for an hour chose to carry with him through a silenced life and set down where he thought no one would look. not what it was. What it was doing, dressed, facing the shore, not adrift, not thrown, not lost, pointed deliberately at the land, in a garment made without a single stitch, as though it had set out clothed to be received and had come up short of whatever it was swimming toward. And so I bring you back to the beginning, to the grey Atlantic swell off County Mayo, and the men standing to their knees in the cold water with the ropes gone slack in their hands, looking down at the long pale shape they have just hauled out of the sea and cannot make themselves touch. The robe fused to it, the webbed hands folded as if some other hand had laid them so. The face they would only ever describe in whispers. They did not know what it was. Coleman did not know what it was. The bishop who buried it in earth and then in paper did not know what it was, only that it must not be remembered. And a century and a half later, with the grave empty, the pages gone, the names struck and the register torn, neither do we. But there is one question the sea never gave back, the one Coleman set into his breviary and carried inland and died still holding, and I will leave you where he left himself. If it drowned, this thing that arrived clothed and deliberate and facing the land, what had it dressed itself to reach, and what, out there beyond the last soundings, had dressed it and let it go?